Yeah, my name's Dennis McCarten. Opened the shop in Pawtucket in actually 2007. The other day had occasion to look at invoice number 2 because the fellow who I wrote it for passed away. He was a sweet guy from Jamestown, used to be the police chief there. And since I opened the shop in 2007, there has been no opportunity to build violins. It's just I've been totally occupied with the paperwork. I was commiserating with somebody tonight about having to do paperwork and file tax returns and the things that go into having a day-to-day retail business. The pandemic delivered a silver lining to me when I had to go home. As a retail shop, I had to close for the better part of 6 months and lay off the 2 workers I had that were helping. And I built out a shop at home so I can make violins again. I went to Lakeside Trading in Narragansett and I bought a 10 by 14 shed. I put it in my yard, ran electricity to it, got myself a portable air conditioner, a heating unit, and I can work in there year round. So I've just finished the first violin in that shop. It took about a year to build out the place and to get it outfitted. But I say all that by way of explanation that as Merle said, there are a handful of violin makers in Rhode Island who are at the top of their crafts. There's a fellow named Carl Dennis in Warren, Andrew Ryan in Providence, who works on real Stradivari violins and makes copies of those classical instruments that are played in the symphony orchestras and sell for about $20,000 a copy. Tucker Densley, who was he's a violin maker, but probably the world's foremost violin and instrument photographer. And most of the major publications about violins have Tucker's work in them. He lives over in Barrington now. He's mostly a house husband. His wife's a doctor and he's helping raise the kids. Anyway, that's a brief introduction to where I am at this point. So a little bit about me. Grew up 2 miles from here in the shadow of the Narragansett Brewing Company. That's the way it used to look, if anybody remembers. Went on from there to go to college, law school, and spend 28 years as a trial lawyer. This is the courthouse in Providence, if you don't recognize it, where I spent almost every day from 1975 until 2003. In 2003, I enrolled at North Bennett Street School up in Boston. At that time, we had a German master. Has anybody visited the violin program there? It's, yeah. So it went at the old building that's since moved down to the bottom of the hill. We had 10 benches, but only 8 students at the entire 3 years I was there. So we had a single master, Thomas Hummel from Stuttgart, Germany, who basically oversaw the program. It's 3 years full time. So in my class, there were only 4 people learning from scratch. In the second year, Thomas had to go back to Germany to be with his family, and a Polish maker named Roman Barnes came in and took over. The contrast between the two was interesting because Thomas Hummel was the kind of guy who just told you, just put your head down and just get through the first one. It's just important to know how the ankle bone is connected to the knee bone and just to see what the anatomy of a violin is, and just don't sweat the details. Don't make it beautiful. Just make it so you know how everything's supposed to fit. And I made a really ugly violin that year, which won the Golden Turd Award because it looked like shit, but it sounded really good. And I still have it. So anybody wants to visit me, I'll play it for you. So anyway, the North Bennett Street School at the age of 53 was just a marvelous experience to go up there every day for 3 years. Working mostly with young people. My classmates were all in their 30s for the most part. And I came out of there I had left my law firm 3 years previous and had to open a business in order to make ends meet. So I opened McCarten Violins in Pawtucket, and that's what I've been doing ever since. But the lament I have is what I touched on earlier, was that in running a business and becoming, I will say, quite expert at fixing and setting up violins. It's something I've done every day, day in and day out for the last 17 or 18 years. I'll accept praise for that, but my skills at violin making are rusty. But it's been a joy for me to finally get back to it. It's one of those things. I was looking at those lattices, and they're just gorgeous. But the close tolerances that you have there are what we have to have in every single joint in a violin, because it has to be completely relaxed. You can't force anything together. Strong clamps are not an option. In any event, so I thought we just as a beginning here, just to show you, well, first talk a little bit about the history of the violin. The instruments we make today are virtually all based on the classical instruments. And in the violin world, that means Cremona, Italy, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The violin was invented by a man named Andrea Amati in Cremona, which is in northern Italy, I think on the River Po. I know my geography. In they say about 1540, and the Amati family then continued as the dominant force in Cremona for a couple of hundred years after that. And then a second family called Guarnieri came out of that shop and became equally dominant. And Antonio Stradivari, most of you have heard of Stradivarius, came along in the late 1600s and lived until the age of 92, made a violin when he was 92 years old before he passed away. But they say that he turned out something in the order of 1,100 violins in the time he was working there. All of the violins we make today are basically based upon the designs that were perfected then. What you guys do is just amazing to me, with the small work you can do with power tools. Everything in the violin world, with a couple of small exceptions in the modern shop, is done with a hand tool. And I just brought pictures of my shop today to show you how it's organized and what I have to have at arm's length in order to get a violin made. So let me start with, I got a whole bunch of exhibits here. First thing we'll do when we're going to make a violin is pick an instrument that pleases us. There's a magazine called The Strad, which comes out of London, England. And they, a couple of times a year, publish these full-size scale photographs of an important violin. This is one made by one of the Granaries, known as Del Gesù, because he had the cross and the IHS symbol on his label. So he was identified with Jesus Christ, I guess. So he's Del Gesù. And he worked down the street at the same time as Antonio Stradivari. And I think one of his instruments went last year for $14.8 million at auction. And this is one that he made in the year 1736. And it's one I like because it's on the small side. It might be more suited for a small person or especially a small woman. And the first thing we do to create the model is to follow the inlay line. You see that? That's called the purfling. That goes, this black and white highlight that goes around the periphery of the instrument. And we always use the back as the model rather than the front. The front always has a lot of wear to it. The corners always get nubbed down. by accidents or by bowing or whatever. So the back is usually fairly pristine. This purfling line lines up exactly with the shape of the sides of the violin, which we call the ribs. So if we get a nice good piece of tracing paper and trace that outline, that becomes the basis for our pattern. And what the pattern looks like when it's done is it's this. And this is actually a copy of an actual Stradivari pattern. One of the wags in England had access to all of his tools and jigs and photographed them and put them in a catalog. And this is just a photocopy of one of Stradivari's own patterns. That the actual pattern was complete, but we just picked one half as our pattern, so when we complete it, it's symmetrical, both halves the same shape. And I just glued it onto a piece of aluminum stock. Yeah.
Have you worked on?
I've held two. I've never worked on one. No. I actually got to see when I was taking a varnishing course out in Chicago at the violin making school there. And one of the teachers had a connection with one of the important shops in Chicago and brought a Stradivari out for us to look at. And it was like a gorgeous sunny day in May, and get to look at that thing outdoors in full sunlight. It was just stunning. They say the secret's in the varnish, which is probably not true, but the varnish on those things is just otherworldly. So it looks like you could swim in it. We don't know how they did that. And there's a book this big, literally, and this thick, which with scientific analysis of their varnish. Anyway, back to the form. So this might have been a tracing. I could do this. I could create something like this by tracing the purfling line on one of those photographs. And then from that would build this form. Okay. These holes, of course, are for clamping. And I got some photos that'll show you how this process evolves. But this one, I believe, yeah, is for this violin, which is a copy of a Stradivari violin. So using this and actually a router to, make these crisp edges, we create the form or the mold. It has both names. You'll notice that there are cutouts here, and I'll explain that in a minute, but blocks of wood go into all of these cutouts they form the vertical support for the sides of the violin. And I'll show you a photo in a minute, which will illustrate that. Let me just move on. So all of the tools, this is just my gouge rack. These are all Stubai, steel from Austria. We have two in-channel gouges that we use to cut out inside curves for the blocks that are inside the violin. Some of these big gouges for shoveling wood out. Basically, violin making is sculpture more than it is woodworking. It's shaping the thing out of solid chunks of wood. So those are some of the sharp tools, the gouges. Have a collection of planes. I got a big 100-year-old joining plane, bench plane, the 9.5 bench block planes and a low angle. This is a scrub plane for taking out wood at a good clip when you're first starting out. And this is an old one, which I don't use anymore. The other tool that a lot of people are fascinated by are the thumb planes, which maybe some of you have used or seen. And those are done after you've shoveled out, done the rough work with the with the gouges. You go in and use these small planes, which literally just fit between your fingers. Two of them, this and this, have curved beds because a lot of the work is done in the hollow on the inside. This one is a flat bed, which is used to start to on the first edge of the outside to make sure it's nice and flat and true. So when that inlay goes in, which I'll show you in a minute, it'll have a nice true flat surface to go in. A lot of scrapers. You must all be familiar with Paul Sellers on YouTube. You'll see his video on sharpening scrapers. Changed my life, you know, because they thought they taught us how to sharpen a scraper up in North Bennett, but they were just no good. But Sellers, his method of using a file and then a burnishing tool is just really literally changed my life. And the more mundane things we do. Oops. Yeah, just a little bandsaw just for cutting out rough shapes when we get started. This is a UV light box. Essentially, violin varnish, it typically is oil-based. Violin varnish can be either spirit or oil. So either alcohol or linseed oil, a drying oil. Most of the classical instruments were made with an oil-based varnish, and typically they were cured in the sunlight, so they would hang them outdoors. And I would do that too if it was a good sunny day in warm weather. But when you know, that's not always practical. So we all have some kind of this was actually my footlocker from Clark University that my dad made for me when I went away to college, which I have repurposed as a light box. So these are two UVC bulbs, which you need to seal the box up good so the light doesn't get out, because it can do real harm to your skin and to your eyes. I just today actually installed an exhaust fan on this box. But essentially it's just after each coat of varnish, you have to put the violin in there, secure for at least one full day before you apply another coat. So that's an important tool we have. We have a bending iron. So the only thing that's bent on a violin are the ribs or the sides. And because what you do essentially is you take this strip of maple that you and essentially plane it down to just over 1 millimeter thick, and scrape it and it's finished, and then bend it to the shape of the violin using, you know, it's kind of got a universal curve on it. And it's just done with a very small amount of moisture and using, I think somewhere back here with the scrapers. You can see hanging here, this strap, which is just a flexible metal strap that's used for forming the ribs around that bending iron. So getting into the construction now, this is a picture of a mold with those blocks inserted into the 6 openings that we made. This is a picture of a piece of rib being bent to be inserted into this space. This is what the initial carving phase looks like. This is a violin top made of spruce with the initial rough carving with gouges from the edges towards the top. The center is about 16.5 millimeters thick. We try to maintain that thickness throughout. And the true Italian arching, when this violin is done, will have a single high point right here, and everything will flow downhill from there. This is just a piece. I don't know what's ever going to become a violin, but this is the start point for a violin plate after, say, this is a piece of maple. This is the spruce that needs to be jointed and glued together. There's always a center seam that's book matched. And this is the rough plate for the violin back, which is made of maple. So yeah, let me show, I guess, some material that I showed you. So now this is a wedge of good, probably Sitka spruce, northern growth spruce, which is very straight, narrow grained. It's quartered. So this is just a wedge taken from a tree. And this will be resawn down the middle. And the two jointed edges will then be clamped and glued together. From south. I'm sorry? This maple here, well, this is spruce, which is the town board, the top. And the back is, I would say, I don't know, it's a European genus that comes from the Carpathians, which is a very hard material. And a lot of times, you know, this flame pattern that's in it really confounds you when you're trying to carve across it. But this is a nice piece with very regular figure to it. Maybe somebody here can help me, because this is going to be a one-piece violin back. What I'd like to do is resaw a wedge off of here. So this will become, you know, eventually end up in this tent shape. And then use the scrap that's cut off here to create the rib stock that I'm going to use to bend for the sides. But all I have is like a Japanese saw that I'll do it by hand. That would take forever. Just one trick, because somebody's got a large capacity bandsaw that could be used for that. This is, so I told you, we use those little flat thumb planes to create a nice table around the edge of that plate when it's still rough. We cut a channel. We have you know, just a marking gauge that goes around the edge to locate where the purfling channel is going to go. And then essentially with a thin blade knife, probably you know, a single bevel knife, go down and deepen that channel. And then with a different pick, just remove material from the channel. And then you take the purfling material, which is essentially three layers of very thin wood. And I think most of the modern purfling that you buy commercially is pear wood, perhaps. And the outer layers are just dyed black, and the center layer is left natural state and glued together and cut into very long, thin strips. And it's very easily bent on the bending iron. Excuse me, the bending iron. The real challenge is to get these miters looking as pretty as the ones on these old instruments, so that the corners look just as slick as that. And the purfling is just put in with hide glue, which we usually use like a syringe to just lay a thin bead in there, and then hammer the purfling in and let it dry.
Do you use hide glue throughout the process?
You know, it's the only glue that we would use. Yeah, it's a good quality rabbit hide glue. Probably a ratio of 2-to-1 water to glue crystals. When you're gluing the top on a violin, you generally would use a weaker solution, because you want that, because the top is so, it's strong in that the you know, those dark winter grains are very have great tensile strength, almost the same as ebony. But it will shear along the grain lines. So if the glue joint is too tight, where it's glued to the sides, expansion and contraction can cause cracks. So what you would rather have happen would have the butt joint between the top and the rib just come loose. And it's a very common repair, open seams, so-called. Just to clean it out, use a palette knife to put new glue in there and clamp it back. But it's always rabbit glue, and the top is always a very thin solution. The back and the neck, you want obviously a stronger formula, especially the neck, because it's just a compound dovetail. And the whole strength of the joint really is just the glue between this button, which is the top of the back, and the base of the violin's neck. So really all of the strength of that joint is located right there. And it's commonplace for kind of severe injuries to happen, because once this is cut to thickness, and then you do that channel to put the purfling around there, it is really only about 1.5 millimeters of maple left that's glued to the bottom of the neck. So any kind of torsion upward of the neck away from that button can cause it to literally break off the back, which is a really major repair involving taking the back off the violin and grafting new material behind the button to reinforce it when you put it back together. Another interesting thing is how the F holes, the sound holes, are put into the instrument. This is a scrap top that I just used for varnish experiments, but essentially there's a hand cutter which creates these circular holes. You can see I'm using it there. This is 6 millimeters, that's 9. And once those are done, then you might take that Craftsman scroll saw and cut along, the outline of the F hole, which you would literally draw onto the top using that pattern, or a pattern like this one. This is taken from a Stradivari instrument, so it's particularly pretty. And once you using the what do you call it, the coping saw, you basically rough cut it, and then the final work is done with a single bevel knife, just working along the grain to make that the F hole to the final dimension that you're looking to create. Then there's the neck. The neck of the violin. It's made from a single block, also with that hard maple. Essentially what we have to do is true up this angle to make sure that you get a 90-degree here. And then this has to be perfectly flat, because this is eventually going to become the fingerboard surface. The ebony fingerboard on the violin is going to be glued to this surface when this is finished. And the way the neck is created is also with a pattern. So this is copied from on those posters that you get with the Strad magazine that I mentioned. They also have pictures, scale pictures of the neck. And this will be clamped on here like this. The edges having been trued up, you'll be able to run it on a bandsaw table that's square, and to make a rough cut of the outline. Yeah, it shows here, that process. The top picture is the form clamped to the block, squaring it up in the middle, and then that's the rough cut version at the bottom. Once that's done, there's a kind of a sawing technique to create the scroll. And this is, see here, we've made pinpricks to show the outline of the scroll. And then we're drawing radii around that and cut in using just a craft saw to various depths to achieve the, you know, the ramp effect of the scroll when it's finished, and using a chisel, just remove the extra wood. And then finally, just with chisels, or a lot of times with curved gouges, just to straighten those walls and gradually work around until you achieve this. Okay. So this came out of a block like this one. This has to be 42 millimeters across to make sure that these ears are the correct dimension when you're finished. The saw cuts are made, like I said, in different radiuses and different depths, so that you can rough cut it, and then just using chisels, you do the fine work to get it down to the final shape. There's a lot of recurves too. So this is all recessed and curved inside these ramps. And some of the nicest violins you look at will still show the tool marks that the maker left behind when he was doing that work. Well, no, Thomas Hummel, that first instructor, it just had us create a jig that was clamped to the bench, and it was nothing but a semicircle. Piece of wood about that thick, semicircle that would kind of cradle this, and it would just hold it still, just to put something, just a third hand to hold it against. You don't clamp it anywhere. Essentially, yeah, it's a one-handed operation. Yep, but no special jigs at all, just something to hold it, to keep it still. It's such an involved process. It's hard to simplify what I do. But that's what a violin looks like when you're done. So that's all I have for the picture show and tell. If anybody's really interested in trying this yourself, there's really only one kind of pedestrian resource that will suit anybody with basic woodworking skills that shows all this stuff. And these photographs, a lot of them came from this book. But this is a very detailed description of how the violin is created. And it's by a couple of Englishmen, Chris Johnson and Roy Portnoy, who went to the Newark School, which is the other important violin making school in England. Yeah. Not really. No. I mean, if you're gonna, sometimes the edge work, no. I mean, we don't even use files. Except, and I was about to say, once in a while, when you're turning the edge of you're finishing a violin plate, and you want this edge to have a nice, in profile, it would look like the prow of a canoe. So come up, and there's a recurve behind it, comes up to a crest, and then turns under. And ideally, you're going to make that curve with a knife, but most people cheat and have a fine, a fine tooth file, a curved file, just to finish it off. But everything's done with sharp tools, and ideally sharp tools, sharp scrapers. Yeah. Yeah. You're doing one side to side, front to back.
The grain, so that.
Well, the grain,
That's quarter saw. That's quarter saw.
yes, it's quartered. Yeah,
So the grain is straight.
the grain is going this way. Yeah, this is, yeah,
And so on the end, it is, are you running
to show the,
that? Does it matter if you're doing years here or here? You have to be concerned with how this is oriented.
yes, yes. So this is the end grain.
Yeah,
This will be the base, at the top of the scroll.
right. So
This will be the face of it, which is the,
understand. So again, this is an asymmetrical piece, right? So it's
right.
square.
Yeah, we might put a piece of wood on it to flatten it.
Sure. But you do have to be concerned whether, when you first cut it, this looks to me like this is going to be the front.
No, that's gonna be the side.
Well, that's gonna be the side.
Yeah. So this is a bit of quartered wood too. You see where the grain goes, where the
Yeah.
flame goes?
Yeah.
Goes in this orientation. Well, it's actually this one. Does that answer it?
Yes.
Sure. Sorry, Tim.
Is that difference decorative or is it structural?
Which?
Whether the flames on the side or base of.
It's both. You need the grain for strength to be going in a linear direction along this wood. This is the grain direction. The flame is creative, you know, the xylem and the phloem that go up and down the tree that carry water and nutrients up and down. In this particular genus of tree, I guess they undulate through the tree. So when it's even slab cut or quartered, it exposes this kind of holographic effect because you're looking into those. You follow? Yeah.
So what I was thinking, it's gonna be very, very difficult to carve that scroll.
Yep.
Depending whether you're-
It's difficult to carve, but
Okay.
yeah, but for instance, when you're carving those walls, okay, that's a pretty clean cut all the time. Where you get chatter is when you're cutting these recesses, this chamfer, you know, that goes in. But even then, if you got a nice sharp gouge, it's not, it generally works pretty well. And then it's scraped finally.
So you make the cut, so you move the major amount of slump, or you break the channels, and then it's probably just a straight, just chunks of wood. And then you start to use the gouges.
Right. Yeah. So you're gonna have a bunch of triangles here, you know, after you cut those the saw cuts, and you just chop them. And then you make the curved shape with the gouge, and the gouges, if you looked at my array, they're all different diameters, they're all different curves.
So are your gouges standard profile? Gouges straight across.
I'm not sure what you mean.
The shape of the cutting, you gotta reduce the
Right.
part.
They-
So you don't clearly use H5 gouges. Some people from using files.
Yeah.
And they use two cherries or whatever you show the students.
Yep.
Most of them are five. So I'm aware, come available from the cutting edge, the business end, they cut it flat straight across.
Yep.
And then a bunch of folks who like to do different things, really like to put a fingernail on that rather than using that straight cut across the edge. It makes a huge difference. So what kinds of shapes you can carve. I think it's kind of like it's two. You can make it gouge, turning gouge, you could have a missing flat. You could have a turning gouge, nothing straight, yeah, finger.
You said fingernail, Brian?
No.
The very end of it. The very end of it is contour instead of flat.
Yes, exactly, exactly. But where the arrows is, which is the cutting edge, it's the sharp edge. This is where the flat is. You can have that tip of the tool, fingernail. You look at this, you can have it cut straight. It makes a huge difference.
So, I mean, all of the scroll cutting gouges are that shape.
Finger.
They're all curved.
Okay.
Yeah, with an outside bevel. So the inside surface is flat,
It's not-
yeah, but the end is curved. See if I can. Look, this is the courthouse again. So all of these are the scroll cutting gouges. You see the ends of them? Is that the curve you're talking about?
Yeah, they're not big fingernails. It's like,
Meaning the difference between
yes, there you go.
this one, where it's flat straight across,
Right,
That's big.
or a fingernail where instead of these,
Yeah.
these here, these wings are filed off to get this shape
okay, so
instead of this.
all of the gouges that I use to carve the scroll have the curved end. They're right there. That whole top row.
Yeah, not as drastic as
No.
this, but
Yeah.
they're not, they're all
And they're all different sweeps, depending on which,
curved corners instead of straight across.
right. And they're all different sweeps, depending which turn you're working on.
Looks like you have some details up there. I'm not sure. It's Japanese.
Yeah, those are just chisels, the flat chisels.
These watches.
Yeah, I use them.
Sounds to me like very tedious. It takes a tremendous amount of control. You're just cutting those channels personally with a knife. And you have one phone, just totally have it drawn.
There's a scribe. You do it first with a scribe that goes around the edge. It makes a slight indentation, but then you deepen it to about 2 millimeters with a single bevel.
So you're tracing off the outer edge of the wood,
Mm,
right?
With a flat facing the,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, the outside,
And you don't use a.
depending which direction you're going. Yeah.
Don't use a cartridge with a deep.
No, it's a little pick.
And is that done after the violin assemble?
No, if you, let me get back to that picture. It's when it's in the rough carved state where you basically have, oops, it was. So basically you've just started with just removing wood towards the center. This is all very rough behind here, but then you carve a very flat table around the whole edge. Then insert the purfling. And then once it's in, then you carve again another kind of a recurve behind that edge. So taking off the top surface of the purfling, and it ends up in the base of that channel. Okay, and then as describing the canoe shape, the canoe profile of this edge. So it comes down from the highest point down into that trough. The purfling's at the bottom of the trough, then it comes up to a crest, and then it's rounded on this way. Okay.
How do you attach the sides? Like, there's no rabbet, like rabbet.
No, it's a butt joint.
For the side to like nest into, right?
Yeah,
So,
once, I mean, there's so many steps to making a violin, but once you assemble the ribs around this form. Um. So they, this sits in the middle, the ribs are about 30 millimeters tall. So you got, 10 millimeters of exposure above and below. So it's about 1.5 mm thick, which is really an insufficient thickness for a good gluing surface. So we put a lining in there. It's about another millimeter thick. That's also just a piece of spruce that's bent. It's about 7 millimeters high, another 1.5 mm thick, and it is at the top edge of the rib and the lower edge. And then just to save weight, we trim that so it's tapered. And only at the very top is it full width. But you end up with over 2 millimeters of gluing surface.
so it's one gluing surface.
Single, yeah. And essentially it's just a butt joint.
Okay.
But which is also the reason everything has to be perfectly flat. The top of the rib structure has to be flat. The bottom of the plate has to be flat. So it's just a relaxed fit and sits on there and glues together.
How big is the piece of that?
What about it?
How thick? Yeah.
Yeah.
How thick?
Oh, how thick? It's, I think it starts out, I mean, the blanks are pre-curved, they have that the top for surface is curved. You plane the bottom, you plane it down so that the edge, the exposed edge is about 5 millimeters. But in the center, because it curves over, is probably closer to 8, and then back to 5 on the other side. But again, there's another instance where everything has to be perfectly flat. The surface of the neck, has to mate perfectly with the bottom of that ebony. So it's a nice relaxed joint. That's also attached with hide glue. One of the advantages of the hide glue is that it's reversible. It fractures. So you can get if a fingerboard has been put on correctly, it won't ever fall off, but you can easily take it off just with a thin blade. Yeah. Yeah.
So 2 questions. First, how many pieces are in rib? Is it single?
Well, it can be. That's a good question. It can be. Some makers who have a lot of schmaltz will have one that does the entire bottom curve. But then there's a separate one here, 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 and here. So typically this is done in 2 pieces, and there's a joint at the base. So there's 6 pieces of rib stock. You start with the C, and then you just go around. Hmm?
Those are all button jointed as well.
No, the blocks that were inserted into here are then shaped to match this outline. And this is where they use the in-channel gouges to carve this straight and perpendicular, and the ribs are glued. It's a surface joint, it's not a butt joint, but there's a good gluing surface at the blocks. The blocks are probably the most important structural component of the whole thing.
Blocks become part of the violin, not just there.
Yeah. And when the violin has all been assembled, or the ribs have been assembled, the linings are put in, then these blocks are trimmed out so that there's really only just the wood that's in the very corner is all that's left. And again, that's done for weight. It's also got an effect on the tonality of the thing, because this is essentially an echo chamber, and the walls of it need to be smooth. In fact, Stradivari even he called guitar-shaped violins, but had no corners like this. They're just a complete smooth contour. Yeah, which is quite a challenge to.
So the guitar is internal abrasive.
Right.
Is there- but it's not.
Well, violin, no, it doesn't. There is in the top of a violin, when this is hollowed out and carved to a thickness of about 2.5 millimeters overall for the top. A violin on the inside is not symmetrical. So you got the two sound holes. So it looks like a symmetrical piece. But underneath on the bass side, the low string, the bridge stands in the middle, is the low string is here. No, here. Underneath that is a bass bar that's attached to the inside. But it's not as structural as it sounds. It has more to do with the dispersal of vibration, of the bass vibrations. And on the treble side, underneath the E string, the high string, there's a sound post inserted, which is a spruce dowel with very fine grain. It's about 5.5 millimeters in diameter, thickness in diameter, and the greens are you cut it so it fits precisely between the top of the violin and the back of the violin, and it stands up just below the E string, and it is crucial to the tone of the instrument because it essentially works as a fulcrum. So if the bridge is here on the top and the vibration of the string is going through the bridge to the top and makes the top vibrate, if that sound post is right under the bridge, everything stops. So it is typically just really 2, 3, maybe 4 millimeters below the bridge foot, away from the bridge, to permit the top to move. And every violin has its own sweet spot. There's no right or wrong place to put the sound post. It's just part of the voodoo of the thing. Yeah. Yeah.
So when you're finishing, what would strings would attach to the outside surface? The bridge just to hold the strings. So you glue the bridge on it?
No,
It's just this.
it just stands there under tension. Yeah. It has to be very precisely carved. The feet, it's, I mean, to get a new violin bridge might cost $150, but it's all the labor it takes to fit it. It's only 4.5 millimeters thick, maybe 30 millimeters tall.
Is that the same maple? Or is that something else?
It's also quartered maple. And the better stuff has been off the hook for years and has zero moisture content. Very strong stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
One question, you mentioned
The button
where the neck.
where the neck meets the back. Yeah, the body. On the what?
Yes,
This is the button.
so when you're putting on the neck and string the instrument, tighten the strings, you're putting pressure on it. How much pressure, how many pounds?
Well, I think the measurement where the strings cross the bridge,
Yes,
I understand it's something in the order of 45 pounds per square inch. Right at the base of the bridge.
for each string or for the?
No, for the total,
For the total.
the total weight.
So does it?
And that is a strain.
Pulling on it.
Yeah.
I think that would be
Well, that's when it's a frequent location for fractures. Any excess, like if a violin gets bumped and the back of the neck, the back of the scroll gets bumped, it can pull that away. And yeah, you're in a world of hurt when that happens. If you got a cheap violin, it's a cheap fix, but you got a good violin, it's almost a rebuild.
And that's just a glued joint, right?
Hmm?
That's just a glued joint.
It's just a glue joint.
There's no hardware.
No,
Right?
although, when started, the classical makers did use nails. Yeah, there were 3 nails through, the block.
Block at the end.
The block at the top.
Yeah.
So that's where you carve the compound dovetail to fit the neck in. But on the inside, through that block, there were 3 nails into the base of the neck.
To keep it from slipping out.
Yeah.
out of it.
And then sometime in the 19th century, all of Stradivari, all of those classical instruments were made for Baroque orchestras. So they had a short, squat neck with a short fingerboard that was usually made of maple, might even have inlay on it. They discovered in the 19th century that if you lengthen the neck slightly, change the angle of the neck so that the angle of the fingerboard is steeper. You get a lot more power out of the instruments. So all of those instruments were retrofitted in the 19th century. They chopped the necks out of them. And that's where, that's when a guy named Violin in France perfected that compound dovetail that we use today as the complete joint. There's no hardware needed if it's done well. Yeah.
Is there significant difference? The dimensions of a cello or viola?
That's a good question, because a violin, a viola, and a cello really are the same methods. A viola, I always say, remember the old saw that, the laws of physics, according to the laws of physics, a bumblebee shouldn't be able to fly because, it's too heavy for the wings or whatever. I think the same is true of a viola. The dimensions, the ratios of thickness to length, and the frequency of that C string, that big fat C string at the bottom, shouldn't work. But once in a while, it does come together, and there's some great violas. But it's fortunately it's a necessary member of the orchestra. You have to have something in that range, so the viola exists to fill that tonal range.
So I remember last question, whatever the paper thought,
Carleen Hutchins. Carleen Hutchins, right? She made the octet. Yeah. From a tiny violin to a huge double bass. Was it 8 instruments?
something like that.
Yeah, and I've seen pictures of them. They all,
But her methods never took off. Nobody ever adopted.
nobody ever, no, it never really became mainstream. No, all violins are between, we usually measure a violin by the length of the plate ear to ear. They're all between 354 and 359 millimeters end to end, period. Violas, which are kind of non sequiturs, can be anywhere. For whatever reason, again, historically, I don't know, they're measured in inches. So they can range from 14 inches to 16.5 inches, this dimension. And cellos typically are 750 millimeters from edge to edge. But the construction methods are the same. The acoustical science, I think, is the same in terms of the ratios of heights to volume, essentially the air volume on the inside. Yes.
I just wanted to verify, you said in the very beginning, there's no bending
Other than the ribs on the side,
everything else is
it's
okay.
carved, yeah, from whole wood.
Oh, and the ribbing is a strip of sort of cross green.
It would be, so if using this piece of maple, if I were to make ribstock from this, I'd be resawing strips in this length. Okay, so the grain goes along the side of the instrument. You follow the wood grain?
So the instrument is standing up this way.
Right.
Green, so
No, the wing goes up and down.
it goes up and down.
Yeah.
Around the
This flame pattern goes across the edges. But no, the grain is longitudinal. It always goes.
And do you frequently find that you are customizing the instrument for musicians? Musicians have to find.
Well, that's a question asked somebody like Andrew Ryan in Providence, who's making instruments for professionals.
I haven't.
It's a very personal thing. So you make an instrument, I might make an instrument to this pattern as I'm doing now, and somebody will play it and love it or not love it. But even if somebody hates it, somebody comes along next week and it's exactly right for them. It's just, the interaction between the hand, the bow, and the violin is unique to every player. So there's almost, a player might come in and say, I want something more bassy, or I want something that's got a deeper tone. You might gravitate towards a particular model, maybe the Guarneri line of instruments, because they tend to have slightly elongated sound chamber with shallower C, They were a little wider in the middle, so they tend to give a deeper tone. Whereas the Stradivari, which has a narrower waist, more of a feminine outline, tend to be brighter and brilliant.
I know it's very personal. He's an amateur cellist, and it's one cello that is, I think, upwards of a couple $100,000. She has another one that was custom made for her by a maker.
Okay,
But she.
Claire Givens of it.
Gaston and Claudine. Gaston is the cello and Claudine is the book. Pretty Tracy.
Well, I have one story. I had an old couple came into the shop one day, 10, 12 years ago. And they had a violin they had hidden under the bed for years because the boys had already destroyed Uncle Frank's violin. So they hid this one from the boys, right? So they had no idea what they had. The boys were up and out of the house, they'd grown up, and they brought it in. They had a nice German violin, might have been worth a couple of $1,000. But the bow was made in Paris in 1922. Conservatively worth $22,000. Yeah. Yeah, I took it up to Boston to have it appraised by a friend of mine who does Yo-Yo Ma's bows, you know, he's that caliber. And I brought it back and I had to tell these people what they had. And we offered to buy it from them for a good amount of money. And my friend would have restored it. And he would have sold it to one of his high-end clients. And I told them what they had and what we could do. And they said, oh, we better go talk to the boys. The boys, what brought you here anyway? And I never saw them again. And they even took my bow case with them.
And it's decently, you have to be very sensitive to acidity, temperature. I mean.
Yeah, I used to
to.
obsess about it, but I'm a little, as long as it's not extreme. When I first went into the building, I'm in a Pawtucket, I was in an upstairs room while they were still building out the downstairs. And November 1st, they put on this blowers overhead for the heat. And it was just hot air that blew in. My humidity dropped to 14%. And I had humidifiers running 24/7. Downstairs, it's been much better. Violins like to live in an atmosphere between 40 and 60% humidity, relative humidity. Yeah, and temperature extremes can hurt too. In a hot trunk of a car, the varnish can boil off. I've seen that. Yeah. But